My wife's harmless prank sent me to prison for 6 years. The detective slid the photo across the table at 2:17 a.m., and my stomach dropped through the floor. Not because I recognized what I was seeing, a woman with a swollen face and terror in her eyes, but because the woman was Vanessa, my wife, and I'd been at a work dinner with 12 witnesses when those bruises supposedly happened. The detective didn't know that yet, didn't care. He'd already decided I was guilty the moment she walked through the precinct doors. His name was Franklin Oates, 23 years in homicide before transferring to domestic violence, the kind of cop whose eyes had gone flat from seeing too much horror. He tapped the photo with one thick finger, the nail bitten down to nothing. She says you did this. Says it's been happening for years. Says last night you finally went too far. His voice was casual, almost bored, like he'd given this speech 1,000 times to 1,000 men who all claimed innocence. I opened my mouth to explain about the dinner, about the restaurant receipt in my wallet with a timestamp, about the 12 co-workers who'd watched me eat pasta and discuss the Morrison account until nearly midnight. But Oates held up his hand. Save it for your lawyer. Right now, I need you to understand something. Your wife is in the hospital. Fractured rib, possible internal bleeding, contusions consistent with being beaten unconscious. She's terrified, and she's brave enough to press charges. The words didn't make sense. I'd left for the dinner at 6. Vanessa had been fine, irritated about our argument that morning, but physically fine. I'd gotten home at 12:30 to find the apartment empty, her phone going straight to voicemail. I'd assumed she went to her sister's place to cool off. Hadn't imagined she was at a hospital. Hadn't imagined any of this. You're under arrest for assault in the first degree. Oates stood, pulling handcuffs from his belt with practiced efficiency. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. The Miranda rights continued while he cuffed my wrists, the metal cold and too tight. I kept trying to interrupt, to explain, to make him understand this was impossible. He ignored every word, led me through the precinct past other cops who looked at me with disgust, past a room where I glimpsed Vanessa through a half-open door, her face destroyed, a female officer holding her hand while she cried. The holding cell was concrete and fluorescent lights, a bench bolted to the wall, a toilet in the corner that reeked of disinfectant and despair. 3 other men occupied the space, all of us waiting for arraignment, none making eye contact. I sat on the bench and tried to process what was happening, tried to remember our argument that morning. I'd confronted Vanessa about credit card statements I'd found, $15,000 charged to accounts I hadn't known existed. She'd laughed, actually laughed, told me I was being paranoid and controlling, told me to trust her. When I pushed for answers, she'd grabbed her purse and left. That was it. That was the entire confrontation. I'd raised my voice. She'd raised hers. We'd argued the way married couples argue about money and trust and honesty. Then she'd left, and I'd gone to work. No violence, no touching, no indication she was planning to spend the evening manufacturing evidence of abuse. The public defender arrived at 4 in the morning. His name was Leonard Gaines, public defender's office, 30 years old but looking 50, surviving on coffee and the delusion that any of his clients might be innocent. He sat across from me in an interview room and flipped through police reports with the enthusiasm of someone who'd already given up. Hospital documented severe trauma. Multiple witnesses confirm history of abuse. Wife has photographic evidence of previous injuries she never reported. You're looking at 5 to 8 years minimum if convicted. I told him about the work dinner, about the 12 witnesses who could confirm my alibi, about the credit card debt that gave Vanessa motive to lie. Gaines took notes, but his expression never changed. Alibi helps with the assault last night, doesn't address the pattern of abuse she's alleging, and questioning her credibility about money makes you look controlling, which supports her narrative. This is bad. This is really bad. The arraignment happened 8 hours later. I stood in an orange jumpsuit, hands cuffed, while Gaines entered a not guilty plea in a voice that suggested he didn't believe it. The prosecutor was Judith Reeves, mid-40s, expensive suit, voice like gravel being poured over broken glass. She addressed the judge with controlled fury. Your Honor, the defendant has demonstrated escalating violence over the course of his marriage. The victim has documented injuries spanning 18 months. Last night's attack was so severe, she lost consciousness. We're requesting remand without bail. Gaines argued I had no priors, owned a home, worked as an architect for 12 years at Brennan and Associates. Stable employment, community ties, no flight risk. The judge looked at Vanessa sitting in the front row, her face a horror show of purple and yellow bruising, one eye swollen completely shut, medical tape visible beneath her blouse. Her sister Claire sat beside her, arm around her shoulders, both of them crying quietly. The judge set bail at $500,000, cash or bond. I didn't have $500,000, didn't have $50,000 for a bondsman. My retirement account held $62,000, but liquidating required weeks. My parents were dead. My brother Kyle was deployed overseas with the army. I had nobody who could post that kind of money. The judge remanded me to Rikers Island to await trial. Rikers was every nightmare about prison made real. Concrete and steel, and the constant smell of industrial cleaner failing to mask worse smells underneath. My cell was 8 by 10 feet, bunk beds bolted to walls, toilet in the corner with no seat, a cellmate named Deshawn who sized me up the moment I walked in. "What you in for?" His voice was flat, testing. When I said domestic assault, his face changed. He moved his belongings to the far bunk without another word. Even here, even among criminals, my alleged crime made me untouchable. Deshawn warned me that night, voice low so the guards wouldn't hear. "You need to request PC, protective custody. Yard finds out you beat your wife, they'll fuck you up. Don't matter if you did it or not. The accusation is enough." I told him I'd be fine. Told him the truth would come out. Told him I'd be released once people understood this was a setup. He laughed, a sound without humor. Nobody believes that. Nobody ever believes that. 3 days later I learned he was right. I was standing in the lunch line when someone threw a cup of liquid at my face. Boiling water mixed with sugar to make it stick, to make it burn deeper. The pain was instant and total, my skin melting, my vision going white. I screamed and hit the floor while someone kicked my ribs. Guards rushed in with batons, dragged me to medical while the cafeteria erupted in cheers. The burns covered my left cheek and neck, 2nd degree, the kind that would scar permanently. The prison doctor, a tired woman in her 60s, cleaned the wounds with antiseptic that hurt worse than the initial burning. She asked if I knew who did it. I said no. She didn't believe me but didn't push. Said I'd be in medical for a week, then transferred to protective custody whether I requested it or not. Wife beaters don't survive general population. You should have known that. Protective custody was solitary by another name. 23 hours a day in a cell, 1 hour in a recreation cage by myself, no contact with other inmates, nothing to do but think about how my life had imploded. I spent weeks replaying every moment of my marriage, searching for the point where this became inevitable. Couldn't find it. Vanessa and I had been good together. Not perfect. We'd argued about money and her spending habits, but good. Happy. Or so I'd believed. The discovery documents arrived 6 weeks later. Leonard Gaines brought them during his first visit since arraignment, dropped the manila envelope on the table between us with a thud that suggested he'd already read the contents and didn't like what he'd found. "This is everything the prosecution has. It's not good." He wasn't exaggerating. 247 pages of evidence against me. Police reports describing Vanessa's injuries in clinical detail. Hospital records documenting fractures, contusions, defensive wounds on her forearms, consistent with blocking strikes. Photographs of her face from multiple angles, professional quality, the kind of documentation that looked exactly like what you'd expect from long-term domestic violence. Statement from her sister Claire claiming she'd witnessed me shove Vanessa during an argument 3 months earlier, had seen bruises she tried to hide with makeup, had begged Vanessa to leave me. Statement from Vanessa's co-worker Diane describing suspicious injuries over the past 8 months, long sleeves in summer, jumping when people approached unexpectedly, making excuses about being clumsy when asked about bruises. Diane had kept a journal documenting her concerns, dated entries describing each incident, the kind of contemporaneous record that would be devastating at trial. Statement from our neighbor, Mrs. Kapoor, reporting that she'd heard shouting from our apartment on multiple occasions, usually late at night, usually my voice raised in anger. She'd considered calling building management but hadn't wanted to interfere in our marriage. Now regretted not acting sooner. Timeline of abuse constructed from these accounts, starting 18 months ago with verbal aggression and escalating to the assault that put Vanessa in the hospital. Every incident documented, every witness corroborating the next. The prosecution had built a narrative so comprehensive it looked unbreakable. I read every page twice, searching for inconsistencies. Found one immediately. Claire's statement claimed she'd witnessed me shove Vanessa during an argument at our apartment on July 15th. But I'd been in Philadelphia that entire weekend for an architecture conference, had hotel receipts and registration confirmation to prove it. I showed Gaines, pointing out the dates. He nodded slowly. That helps. But it doesn't destroy their case. She could have gotten the date wrong. Memory is unreliable. What about Diane's journal? The entries are too perfect, too detailed, like someone created them specifically for trial. Gaines shrugged. You're asking me to prove a negative. Prove she didn't witness what she claims. Can't be done. Same with Mrs. Kapoor. She heard arguments. You admit you argued. The shouting supports their narrative even if there was no violence. I asked about investigating Vanessa's background, about finding motive for why she'd fabricate everything. Gaines closed the folder. I've got 297 active cases. I can't afford a private investigator. Can't spend weeks researching your wife's history. Your best option is the plea deal the prosecutor offered. Plead guilty to assault 2nd degree, serve 18 months, 3 years probation, reject it, and face trial for assault 1st degree, mandatory minimum 5 years if convicted. The plea deal felt like swallowing poison, admitting guilt for something I didn't do, creating a permanent record of violence, destroying my architectural license. But 18 months versus 5 years was math I couldn't ignore. I told Gaines I needed time to decide. He said I had 72 hours before the offer expired. I spent those 72 hours in my cell calculating probabilities. If I took the deal, I'd be out in a year with good behavior, could rebuild my life, though the conviction would follow me forever. If I went to trial and lost, I'd serve minimum 5 years, possibly 8. But if I went to trial and won, I'd walk away free with my reputation intact. The question was whether I believed in the system. whether I trusted 12 strangers to see through Vanessa's performance and recognize the truth. I rejected the plea deal, told Gaines to prepare for trial. His expression suggested I'd just signed my own death warrant. The trial began 14 months after my arrest, 14 months of protective custody at Rikers, of isolation and fear and watching my life disintegrate from inside a concrete box. My architectural firm had terminated my employment. My professional license was suspended pending trial outcome. My house was in foreclosure because I couldn't make mortgage payments from prison. Everything I'd built across 40 years was gone, and we hadn't even started jury selection. The jury was 8 women and 4 men, selected after 3 days of voir dire, where both sides asked questions designed to reveal bias. Reeves wanted women who'd identify with Vanessa, see themselves as potential victims, view me as representative of male violence. Gaines wanted men who might question the narrative, require actual proof beyond testimony, resist emotional manipulation. We got a mix, which meant the verdict would come down to whoever told the most convincing story. Reeves gave her opening statement standing directly in front of the jury, close enough to force them to look at her face while she spoke. This case is about power and control, about a man who viewed his wife as property, about escalating abuse that went unreported because the victim was afraid nobody would believe her. She described our marriage as toxic from the beginning, me as controlling and jealous, Vanessa as trapped in a cycle of hope and fear. Described the night of the assault in graphic detail, me coming home angry about money, grabbing Vanessa by the throat, throwing her against the wall, beating her unconscious while she begged me to stop. None of it was true. Every word was fiction delivered with such conviction that even I started doubting my memory. Reeves was brilliant. She didn't just present facts. She constructed an emotional narrative that made my guilt feel inevitable. Gaines gave our opening statement with the enthusiasm of someone reading a phone book. Said the prosecution's case relied on testimony without physical evidence tying me to the assault. Said accusations weren't proof. Said reasonable doubt was the only appropriate verdict. His delivery was flat, mechanical, the legal equivalent of going through motions. The jury looked bored before he finished. Vanessa testified on day 2. She wore a navy dress, conservative and expensive. Minimal makeup that somehow emphasized the fading bruises rather than hiding them. Hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, the image of a woman who'd survived trauma and found the courage to speak. Reeves walked her through our marriage chronologically, starting with how we met at a friend's wedding 8 years ago. Vanessa described me as charming initially, attentive and romantic. Then the mask came off. She said I became controlling after we married. Questioned where she went, who she talked to, what she spent, got angry when she asserted independence. The first time I heard her was 6 months into the marriage, she claimed. An argument about her going out with friends. I'd grabbed her wrist, squeezed until she had bruises, told her she wasn't going anywhere without my permission. She'd covered the bruises with long sleeves and told herself it wouldn't happen again. But it did happen again, and again. Each incident worse than the last. She described me shoving her into the kitchen counter, the impact bruising her ribs. Described me throwing her phone against the wall when I saw her texting a male co-worker. Described the night I slapped her for burning dinner, the sound echoing through our apartment while she stood there in shock. She was crying now, dabbing at her eyes with tissue, voice breaking as she described the final assault. Coming home from her sister's house to find me waiting, angry about the credit cards I'd discovered, screaming at her about the debt. When she tried to explain, I'd grabbed her by the throat, slammed her against the wall, hit her repeatedly while she begged me to stop. The last thing she remembered was falling, then waking up in the hospital with Claire beside her. The jury was transfixed. 2 women were crying openly. The men looked uncomfortable, angry, ready to convict based on testimony alone. Vanessa's performance was flawless. Every emotional beat perfectly timed, every detail consistent with the narrative Reeves had constructed. If I hadn't lived through the actual events, even I would have believed her. Gaines cross-examined her for 30 minutes, asked about the conference in Philadelphia, whether she remembered me being out of town the weekend Claire claimed to witness abuse. Vanessa paused, tilted her head as if thinking carefully. I'm not sure about specific dates. It's all blurred together. Maybe I got the timeline confused, but I know what happened. I know what he did to me. Gaines asked about the credit card debt. About $15,000 in charges I'd only discovered the morning of the alleged assault. Vanessa's expression hardened. He controlled all our finances. I didn't have access to bank statements. I opened those cards because I needed money for basic necessities he refused to provide. Food, clothes, medicine, things a husband should provide for his wife. The lie was so elegant I almost admired the craftsmanship. She'd taken evidence of her deception and flipped it into proof of my abuse. Made her financial fraud look like survival strategy. Made my legitimate concerns look like controlling behavior. Every fact that should have helped me became a weapon in her hands. Gaines asked about the work dinner. About 12 people who could confirm I was at a restaurant when she claimed I was beating her unconscious at home. Vanessa smiled sadly. He left around 8:30, said he was going to a work dinner, but I knew he was lying. He came home at 11, and that's when it happened. She'd adjusted her timeline to account for my alibi. Made it fit. Made it work. Claire testified next. Vanessa's younger sister, 28 years old, graduate student in psychology, voice soft and certain as she described visiting our apartment for dinner one evening. Said she'd arrived to find Vanessa upset, me angry, tension thick enough to cut. The argument escalated, she claimed. I grabbed Vanessa's arm, shoved her toward the bedroom, told her we'd discuss this in private. Claire had wanted to intervene, but Vanessa gave her a look that said, "Don't. Stay quiet." After I left the room, Vanessa had broken down crying, begged Claire not to report anything, said it was her fault for provoking me. Claire's testimony was devastating because she seemed genuinely traumatized by what she'd witnessed. Her hands shook, her voice cracked. She looked at me with real fear, like I might leap across the courtroom and hurt her too. The jury ate it up, saw a concerned sister who'd witnessed abuse and honored the victim's wishes for silence. Nobody questioned why she'd conveniently waited months to report it. Gaines presented the conference receipts during cross-examination. Hotel registration in my name for July 13th through July 16th. Credit card charges from Philadelphia restaurants on July 15th. Physical proof I couldn't have been in New York when Claire claimed to witness abuse. Claire looked at the receipts, confusion crossing her face. Maybe it was a different weekend. I remember what I saw. Maybe I'm confused about when it happened. But it definitely happened. The jury didn't care about the discrepancy. They cared about the pattern. One wrong date didn't invalidate Claire's overall credibility. Didn't change the fact that she'd witnessed something traumatic involving her sister. Diane from the dental office testified on day 3. Described working with Vanessa for 8 months, noticing changes in her behavior and appearance. Long sleeves even in summer. Jumping when anyone approached unexpectedly. Bruises on her arms she tried to hide. Diane had asked about them multiple times. Vanessa always deflected, made excuses, changed the subject. But Diane recognized the signs. Her own mother had been in an abusive relationship. She knew what it looked like. Diane had kept a journal, started documenting her concerns in case Vanessa ever needed evidence. The journal was entered as evidence, passed among the jury for examination, handwritten entries describing each incident. June 3rd, Vanessa came to work with bruises on her left forearm, claimed she'd bumped into a door. June 17th, Vanessa wore turtleneck despite heat, noticed finger-shaped marks on her neck when she moved. July 8th, Vanessa unusually quiet, flinched when Dr. Rosen raised his voice at a patient. The journal looked credible, looked like a concerned co-worker creating contemporaneous records for protective purposes. The jury studied it carefully, reading entries that painted a picture of systematic abuse. Nobody questioned why Diane had documented concerns without ever calling police. Nobody wondered why every entry perfectly supported Vanessa's narrative. Mrs. Kapoor testified briefly. Confirmed she lived in the apartment next to ours. Confirmed she'd heard loud arguments on multiple occasions, usually late evening, usually my voice raised in anger. Said she'd considered reporting it to building management but hadn't wanted to interfere. Now wished she'd acted sooner. Maybe if she'd said something, this could have been prevented. Her testimony was simple and damning. Even I remembered the arguments she'd overheard. Remembered shouting about money and honesty and the credit cards. But shouting wasn't violence. Raised voices weren't assault. The prosecution was conflating normal marital conflict with abuse, and the jury was buying it. The prosecution rested after 3 days. Gaines moved for dismissal based on insufficient evidence. The judge denied the motion without hesitation. Said the jury had heard testimony from 4 witnesses describing a pattern of abuse. Had seen hospital records documenting severe injuries. Had examined photographs consistent with domestic violence. The case was strong enough to go to the jury. Our defense lasted 1 day. Gaines called me to testify first, which his expression suggested was a mistake we were making together. I sat in the witness box and swore to tell the truth. The whole truth. Nothing but the truth. Then I told my version of events. Described our marriage honestly, the good years before Vanessa's spending became problematic. My discovery of the credit card debt. Our argument that morning. Her leaving angry. My work dinner with 12 colleagues. Coming home to find her gone. The police showing up at 4 a.m. to arrest me for assault I'd never committed. I explained I'd never hit Vanessa, never shoved her, never caused any injuries. Explained the hospital records documented real trauma but didn't prove who caused it. Explained that makeup and self-inflicted wounds could create convincing evidence of abuse that never occurred. As I spoke, I watched the jury's faces, watched them close off, watched them stop listening. I sounded like every abuser who'd ever claimed innocence, every husband who'd ever denied what his wife accused him of. The truth didn't matter. Only the narrative mattered. Reeves destroyed me on cross-examination. Asked if I expected the jury to believe my wife had beaten herself unconscious to frame me. Asked if I understood how insulting it was to suggest a domestic violence victim was lying for attention. Asked if I'd ever raised my voice to Vanessa. I admitted I had during arguments. Asked if I'd ever touched her in anger. I said maybe once, not violently, just touching her arm to get her attention during a heated discussion. Asked if I'd monitored her spending. Yes, because we had joint accounts, and I'd noticed irregularities. Every honest answer made me sound guilty. Every admission became evidence of control and violence. Reeves was surgical. She took my attempts to provide context and weaponized them. Took my reasonable concerns about financial fraud and made them sound like abuse. took my explanation about false accusations, and made me sound like every abuser who claims the victim is lying. We called character witnesses. My former boss, Douglas Reed, testified I'd worked at Brennan and Associates for 12 years without incident, was reliable, professional, never showed signs of violence or instability. Reeves asked if he'd been present in my home. No. Asked if professional behavior at work proved anything about private behavior at home. He admitted it didn't. Kyle testified via video conference from his base in Germany. Described growing up together. Said I'd never been aggressive or violent. Said the accusation was completely inconsistent with my character. Reeves asked when he'd last spent significant time with me. 3 years ago at Christmas. Asked if people could change. He admitted they could. Asked if he'd witnessed my marriage to Vanessa firsthand. Only briefly at the wedding. His testimony evaporated under her questions. We had nothing else. No evidence that Vanessa had fabricated the injuries. No proof that Claire and Diane had lied. No explanation for how my wife had orchestrated such an elaborate frame job. Just my word against hers. And in domestic violence cases, juries believed the victim. Closing arguments happened on Friday afternoon. Reeves summarized the evidence methodically. 4 witnesses describing abuse. Hospital records documenting severe injuries. Photographs showing trauma consistent with being beaten. My own admission of raising my voice and touching Vanessa during arguments. My attempt to blame the victim, claiming she'd manufactured everything. The pattern was undeniable. The verdict should be guilty. Gaines argued reasonable doubt. Pointed to the Philadelphia conference proving Claire's testimony about July 15th couldn't be accurate. Noted that none of the witnesses had reported abuse before Vanessa pressed charges. Reminded the jury that injuries didn't prove who caused them. Said accusation wasn't evidence. His argument was logical, but emotionless. Didn't give the jury a reason to care. Didn't offer an alternative narrative. Just poked holes in the prosecution's case and hoped it would be enough. The jury deliberated for 11 hours across 2 days. When they filed back into the courtroom, none of them looked at me. That was the tell. Juries that acquit make eye contact with the defendant. Juries that convict avoid looking at the person whose life they're about to destroy. The forewoman was Patricia Green, 54 years old, schoolteacher, married 28 years, exactly the kind of juror who'd identify with Vanessa. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict. Patricia stood, said they had. The clerk asked her to read it. She looked directly at Vanessa, not at me, when she spoke. We find the defendant guilty of assault in the first degree. The courtroom erupted. Vanessa sobbed with what looked like relief. Claire hugged her. Reeves allowed herself a small smile. The judge banged her gavel for order. I sat frozen, watching my life end in real time. Guilty. One word. Everything gone. Sentencing happened 3 weeks later. Reeves asked for the maximum. 8 years. Said I'd shown no remorse, no acceptance of responsibility, no understanding of harm caused. Said I'd attempted to destroy Vanessa's credibility during trial, which demonstrated continued abuse. Said the sentence should reflect the severity of my crime and protect future victims. Gaines argued for leniency. First offense. No criminal history. Professional career destroyed. Asked for the minimum. 5 years. Said I'd already been punished beyond measure. Vanessa gave a victim impact statement. Described living in constant fear during our marriage. Walking on eggshells to avoid triggering my rage. The relief she felt knowing I was in custody. The terror that I'd be released and come after her. She asked the judge for the maximum sentence. To give her time to heal. To send a message that domestic violence wouldn't be tolerated. I wanted to scream. Wanted to call her a liar to her face. Wanted to force someone to investigate. But I'd lost that right. The jury had spoken. The judge sentenced me to 6 years. Said she'd considered both the severity of the crime and my lack of priors. Said she hoped I'd use the time to address my anger issues. Then she asked if I had anything to say. I looked at Vanessa. She met my eyes with an expression I'd never seen before. Not fear, not relief, something else. Satisfaction. Like she'd won. And I understood. This wasn't about the credit cards. This was about destroying me completely. Taking everything. She'd built a machine designed to grind me into nothing. I told the judge I'd never touched my wife. Never hurt her. Never committed this crime. Told her the truth mattered, even if nobody believed it. The judge looked at me with pity, like I was delusional. She remanded me into custody. Bailiffs led me away. Vanessa watched with tears streaming down her face. Performance to the very end. Eastern Correctional Facility was 3 hours north, medium security, concrete and razor wire, and the death of hope. My cell was 6 by 8 feet. My cellmate was Terrence, 42 years old, embezzlement, philosophical about prison, in a way that suggested this wasn't his first time inside. When I told him my conviction, he moved his belongings to the far bunk without a word. I worked in the prison library, shelving books, processing requests, staying away from general population where my conviction made me a target. The librarian was Grace Whitmore, 60 years old, retired teacher, volunteering because she believed in rehabilitation. She treated me like a human. First person in 2 years who didn't look at me with disgust. The appeals process was automatic. A lawyer named David Schulman reviewed my case, appointed by the appellate division. He read the trial transcripts, examined the evidence, interviewed me for 6 hours. At the end, he said the verdict was wrong, but the trial was technically fair. No grounds for appeal based on legal error. I was guilty according to law. I spent every free hour researching false accusations, studying case law about wrongful convictions, writing letters to private investigators. None responded. Nobody wanted to prove a convicted domestic abuser was actually innocent. Months became years. The rhythm of prison replaced normal life. Morning count, work, meals, yard time, lockdown, repeat. Terrence was released after 18 months. My new cellmate was Jordan, 23, drug possession, terrified. I helped him navigate the system, became the mentor I'd needed. Grace noticed my constant research, asked what I was studying. I explained everything, the false accusation, the coordinated testimony, expected her to dismiss me like everyone else. Instead, she listened, asked questions, took notes, said her daughter was an investigative journalist who specialized in wrongful convictions. Would I consent to an interview? 3 weeks later, Rebecca Whitmore visited. 34 years old, sharp eyes, recorder on the table, skepticism in every question. She'd reviewed my trial transcripts, found things that interested her, asked if I'd tell my story. Rebecca asked about the credit card debt. I explained the $15,000 in charges. She showed me documents obtained through public records. Vanessa had filed bankruptcy 6 years before we met, had accumulated $60,000 in debt from shopping addiction, had court-ordered financial counseling. None of this came up at trial. Gaines never investigated her background. Rebecca asked about Claire's testimony. The weekend she claimed to witness abuse while I was in Philadelphia. She'd interviewed Claire's ex-roommate Stacy, woman who'd lived with Claire during that period. Stacy said Claire had told her about coaching sessions with Vanessa before trial, had practiced testimony, had been nervous about getting caught lying. Stacy had recorded one conversation where Claire admitted she'd never witnessed abuse, but was testifying anyway, because Vanessa needed support. Rebecca asked about Diane's journal documenting Vanessa's bruises. She'd obtained Diane's personnel file through a source at the dental office. Diane had been fired 3 months after my trial, caught falsifying patient records multiple times. Rebecca questioned whether someone who'd falsified dental records might falsify a journal about witnessing abuse. Rebecca asked about the hospital records, the fractured rib, the contusions, the defensive wounds. She'd consulted a forensic pathologist who reviewed the photographs. The doctor said injuries were consistent with a fall from height. The fracture pattern suggested impact against a flat surface, not blunt force trauma. The contusions showed no fingerprints or grip marks. The defensive wounds on Vanessa's forearms looked staged, too symmetrical, too clean. Rebecca published her article 4 months later. Conviction without evidence. How false testimony destroyed an innocent man. The piece outlined every inconsistency, every witness whose story collapsed under scrutiny, every piece of evidence suggesting something other than the prosecution's narrative. It included interviews with Stacy describing Claire's coaching, quotes from the forensic pathologist questioning injury patterns, details about Vanessa's bankruptcy and shopping addiction. The article went viral. 2 million views in the first week. Comments filled with outrage. Media outlets picked up the story. Television programs interviewed Rebecca. Legal advocacy groups contacted Schulman offering support. The machinery that convicted me began reversing. The DA's office defended the prosecution. Said the jury heard relevant evidence. Said the verdict was sound. Said one journalist's opinion didn't overturn lawful convictions. Vanessa gave her own interview. Appeared on morning television looking fragile. Said she was being victimized again. Said false accusations of false accusations were common abuser tactics. Said she stood by her testimony. She was brilliant. Made Rebecca look like someone attacking a victim. But cracks appeared. Stacy went public with the recording. News outlets played the audio. Claire's voice admitting she'd never witnessed violence. Admitting Vanessa asked her to lie. Admitting she'd committed perjury because Vanessa said it was the only way people would believe her. Claire issued a statement. Said the recording was out of context. Said she'd been confused when talking to Stacy. But the damage was done. People heard her voice. Heard her admit to lying. Diane refused comment. Her lawyer said she stood by trial testimony, but the dental office released a statement confirming her termination for falsifying records 3 months after she testified. The timing was damning. The Innocence Project took my case, filed a motion for post-conviction relief based on newly discovered evidence, argued Stacy's recording proved Claire lied under oath, argued Diane's termination cast doubt on her journal's authenticity, argued the forensic pathologist's analysis contradicted the prosecution's theory, requested a hearing. The judge scheduled oral arguments. The prosecution opposed. Said the recording didn't prove anything definitive. Said Diane's termination was unrelated. Said the pathologist was just another expert disagreeing with trial experts. The hearing lasted 2 days. My lawyers presented Stacy, who testified about Claire's admission. Presented the forensic pathologist explaining why injuries suggested a fall, not assault. Presented documentation about Diane's termination. Presented Vanessa's bankruptcy history that should have been disclosed. The prosecution presented original experts reaffirming trial testimony. Presented Claire claiming she'd been coerced into making the recording. Presented Diane's lawyer with an affidavit saying her termination involved one billing error, not systematic falsification. The judge took the motion under advisement, said she'd issue a written decision within 60 days, 60 days became 90. 90 became 120. Rebecca continued investigating, published a follow-up about financial motive. She'd discovered Vanessa filed a civil lawsuit against me immediately after my conviction. Sued for damages related to emotional distress and medical expenses. The civil case was stayed pending appeals, but if my conviction stood, Vanessa would take everything. My house, my retirement. The credit card debt suddenly made sense. She'd spent money knowing she'd recover everything through the lawsuit. The criminal conviction wasn't just about destroying me, it was about profiting from my destruction. Rebecca also found evidence of Vanessa's new relationship. She'd started dating someone 3 months after my arrest. Gregory Stanton, investment banker, divorced, wealthy. They'd gotten engaged 6 months after my conviction, married a year later. Vanessa had been planning her new life while destroying mine. The judge's decision arrived on a Thursday morning. 43 pages of legal analysis. And on page 41, the words I'd waited 3 years to read. The court finds that newly discovered evidence casts sufficient doubt on the verdict to warrant post-conviction relief. The defendant's conviction is hereby vacated. The defendant shall be released from custody, pending potential retrial. I read those words 17 times. Vacated. Released. Not exonerated. Not innocent. But no longer guilty. The machinery was reversing. The release process took 6 hours. Grace hugged me when I left the library for the last time. Said she'd known I was innocent. Rebecca picked me up at the prison gates. Drove me back to the city while explaining what happened next. The DA had 60 days to decide whether to retry me. She believed they wouldn't. Too many damaged witnesses. Too much scrutiny. I stayed with Kyle, who'd taken emergency leave. His apartment was small but quiet. First time in 4 years I'd slept without concrete walls. The DA announced its decision 2 weeks later, declining to retry. Insufficient evidence. Charges dismissed with prejudice. I was free, but my life was destroyed. License suspended. Reputation ruined. House gone. Savings depleted. 4-year employment gap. Conviction vacated but still on my record. The civil lawsuit moved forward. Vanessa's lawyers argued vacated conviction didn't mean innocence. Civil standard was lower. Preponderance of evidence. Original testimony still supported their case. My lawyers countered with everything Rebecca uncovered. Stacy's recording. Diane's falsification history. The pathologist's analysis. Vanessa's financial motive. Gregory Stanton's convenient appearance. The case settled 3 months later. Vanessa's lawyers recognized they couldn't win. Too much impeachment evidence. They agreed to dismiss with prejudice in exchange for mutual non-disparagement. Both parties walked away with nothing. Rebuilding took years. I worked construction initially. Day labor. Cash. Couldn't get hired as architect. Eventually found work as draftsman. Pay was 40% of before, but it was employment. License was reinstated after 2 years. Board required supervised practice and ethics training. Said they needed to protect the public despite exoneration. Rebecca's investigation uncovered one final detail. She'd tracked down Patricia Keene, who'd dated Gregory Stanton before Vanessa. Patricia had accused Gregory of domestic violence, pressed charges, recanted 6 months later, claiming she'd made it up. Rebecca interviewed Patricia, who now claimed Gregory pressured her to recant, threatened her financially. The pattern emerged. Vanessa had watched Gregory pressure Patricia, learned the playbook, applied it to me, turned his tactics against me to clear her path to him. Rebecca wanted to publish this final piece. I declined, told her I was done. Justice wasn't revenge. Some battles couldn't be won. 10 years after my arrest, I married again. Rachel knew my history before our first date, had read Rebecca's articles, believed me without hesitation. We built something careful and honest. I saw Vanessa once more. Chance encounter at a restaurant. She was dining with Gregory. Our eyes met. She looked away first, pretended not to recognize me. I finished my meal and left. Some people never face consequences. The only justice was knowing she had to be Vanessa forever, and I got to be someone else.